A mere 22 miles from the British coast, Hitler's amphibious assault force was assembling. Before the invasion could be mounted, the Luftwaffe had to secure air supremacy. Opposing this objective stood only 367 Hurricanes and Spitfires. Goering had calculated that Britain's southern air defences could be smashed in 4 days, and in a further 4 weeks the whole of the RAF could be annihilated. In France, Denmark and Norway, Goering assembled 3 huge wings or Luftflotten, consisting of 2,800 combat aircraft. Eagle Day, the beginning of the air offensive, was scheduled for early August. It was planned that 5 weeks later, the invasion force would cross the Channel. History would go on to prove, however, that the Nazis had seriously miscalculated. In the subsequent months, the small fighter force of the RAF distinguished themselves. Out of all the German aircraft destroyed, 2/3 were attributable to the Hawker Hurricane. PZ-865 was the last Hurricane of 14,583 to be built. Carrying the markings of 261 Squadron, it now flies with the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight based at RAF Coningsby. Known as the last of the many, today it is piloted by Flight Lieutenant Paul Shenton.
The first thing we do when we come up to the aeroplane is to check out the basic services are there and that it's safe for us to do an external inspection of the aeroplane. We're checking there are no selections made on the hydraulic services. We need to check on the gauge that sits between our feet that we have pneumatic pressure available for the brakes. To make sure that the engine is safe, we ensure that the ignition switches are off. Again, checking all the alignments on the panel screws, exhaust stubs. Doing that, if it sounds any different, then we know we've probably got a crack in it, etc. Come forward to the propeller, general condition of all the blades, and checking there's not too much movement in it. And again, all the fasteners are in line. The second wheel, condition, creak marks, brake, doors, and the bay. Nothing wrong there. Back again to the leading edge, checking the general condition of the leading edge. Landing light, the condition's good, and the cover is fine. Starboard navigation light, condition, cover. Coming round to this side, to the aileron, just checking it's in alignment, which it was, which is why we set the other side up at neutral. Again, nothing conflicting with the movement there. Condition of the top surface of the wing, and the flaps are up. All the panels are secure, particularly this one, which is where our baggage goes, which comes on and off more than the rest of them. General condition, there's a couple of removable panels under here as well, and we're just checking that they're secure. Onto the tail wheel, again checking for creep, general condition of the tyre, oleo extension, not a problem. The tailplane is fine. Coming around to the elevator, again full free unrestricted movement and setting neutral. Coming over to the rudder, again we've got full and free movement. We've now done the external checks and we're happy with the outside of the aeroplane. We now need to set up the cockpit ready to start up. First thing we do is energise the electrical system. We check that the battery has sufficient voltage in to allow us to start. Check that the radiator flap is open, and then all the trims. First the elevator, checking for full and free movement and selecting a neutral. Then the rudder trim, full and free movement, selecting it fully right to help us counter the effects of torque on takeoff. Throttle, full and free movement, and tightening the friction nut up, which is very important because as we get airborne we need to change hands to move the undercarriage, and we don't want the throttle vibrating backwards and closing on us. Checking the RPM is full and free movement. Moving down to the fuel tanks, we're selecting the reserve tank on. We'll start up with the reserve tank on, which proves to us that the fuel is flowing from there. And post start, we'll then move and select the main tanks, and we can then prove that we can get the fuel from there. Supercharger to M gear. Checking again the magnetos are off, the pressure heat is off, and the lights are selected off. Condition of the G meter, and that it's reset to 0. As we pull G as we're flying around, it'll kick up and it'll actually remember the highest setting or the highest pull of positive G and negative G that we've done throughout the sortie, so that we can monitor fatigue. The generator fail light is on. The undercarriage indications are showing 2 green, which tells me that the undercarriage is down and locked. Also, we'll then change over and check the other bulbs are working. Radio selected on and on the frequency we require. We have a VHF system in here, which is not as they had in the Second World War. It's much smaller, more compact, and really more efficient. We'll check the overall condition of the flight instruments, the airspeed indicator, the artificial horizon, the vertical speed indicator, altimeter, the direction gyro, which we align with the magnetic compass, and the turn and slip. Overload tank lights, we check they're both operating. This is the only indication we get of the fuel state in the overload tanks, and really gives us a warning that the fuel's about to run out and we need to do something about it, and just go back to the main selection. Engine instruments, the boost gauge, oil pressure indicator, oil temperature, and the radiator temperature. Also check the fuel pressure light is on. This indicates to us that it's a very low fuel pressure. Obviously at the moment, without the engine running, we would expect that. However, if that came on in flight, then something is probably seriously wrong. We then interrogate the fuel tanks and get readings for both the port main, the centre or the reserve tank, and then the starboard main tank. Checking the kite gas primers in, moving the hydraulic selector to flaps down position, hand pump, pumping the flaps down to 30 degrees, and then reselecting the flaps up. So when we start the engine, the hydraulic pump should power up and automatically bring the flaps up, which proves to us the hydraulic pump is working. Overload tank selected off. Moving round, selecting the brakes and the parking brakes on. And now ready to prime the engine to start up. Once you're airborne and flying around, the things that struck me, when you compare it to a jet airplane, the controls are a lot heavier. You have to coordinate rudder with the aileron more than you would, if at all, in a jet fighter. In fact, in the jet, you tend to just use the rudder pedals for steering yourself on the ground and the footrests in the air. With this airplane, with the secondary effects of roll, being yaw of the aeroplane, you need to work the rudder at the same time as the aileron and the elevators. It's very, very noisy. In a tornado, you could actually talk to each other in the air without the intercom. You can shout. In this aeroplane, display power settings, you're doing your damnedest to actually hear the radio. So the first thing you'll notice is the immense amount of torque effect of this aeroplane. With over 1,000 horsepower, you would expect it. So you're fighting that off with lots of rudder, making your feet work, which I'm not really too used to with the Tornado, and most jet aeroplanes are fairly stable on the ground and pretty much go fairly straight. So we're fighting that. We then need to lift the tail wheel by pushing the control column forward. So we lift the tail wheel to get the aircraft in a level attitude. Again, if you're used to a tricycle undercarriage, like in your Cessna 172, it'll be different, and you'll be pulling back to get the nose wheel off just before you get airborne. get to climbing speed, and this aeroplane you need to quite a positive check to get her airborne. You're up in the air and the overall feel of the aeroplane is lovely. When you get chance to look out, look in the mirror, look at the tailplane, look out at the wings and everything else, and just take in the whole atmosphere of it and the feeling of flying the aeroplane, she's very nice.
By the end of the First World War, the role of the fighter had been defined. Its task was to win control of the skies over the battlefield and prevent the enemy from bombing, strafing or spying. The most famous British fighter of the First World War was the Sopwith Camel. The Hurricane claimed direct lineage to this aeroplane as Sopwith evolved into Hawker engineering. The Camel's construction was typical of the day, a skeleton of wooden formers braced with wires and covered in canvas. Its biplane format gave it tremendous wing area for its size, making it very maneuverable and well suited to close combat. Towards the end of the war, the Germans were experimenting with monoplane designs. However, it was generally felt that the biplane's agility made it better suited to aerial combat. This conviction would seriously disrupt the development of the monoplane for a considerable period after the First World War. In the harsh economic environment that followed World War I, the demand for combat aircraft diminished considerably. With more pressing peacetime requirements and a consequent slashing of military budgets, the RAF was cut back to a skeleton force. Despite this underinvestment in military aviation, progress was being made in the civil sector. A whole series of endurance records had been set, achievements that went lost on the Air Force planners. By the 1930s, it was realized that sizable aircraft had now the ability to cross national borders and bomb foreign cities. For the first time, civilians could be targeted. To deter a foreign bomber force, Britain needed to create its own. It was widely believed that against a massed bomber force there was no effective defense. The ministry allocated the bulk of the air defense budget to the development of bombers. Consequently, fighter development was grossly underfunded and technological development lagged behind. The British fighter force of the early 30s was made up solely from biplanes. It was beginning to be realized that the biplane design had limitations. Wind tunnel tests revealed that the design was intrinsically drag-creating. With struts, wires and fixed undercarriage, the potential for streamlining was limited. Despite this, Hawkers, like most other aircraft manufacturers, were designing aircraft round the well-proven biplane concept. In 1924, Hawker Engineering employed Sidney Cam as their chief designer. One of his first projects was the Hawker Hart, a light bomber with a remarkable top speed of 184 miles an hour. In 1928, this was faster than the RAF fighters of the day. As a result, a fighter version was developed, the Hawker Demon, which came into service with the RAF in 1931. The next project was another fighter, the Hawker Fury. With a top speed of over 200 miles an hour, this represented the pinnacle of Hawker's biplane design. But by the mid-30s, when it came into service, it was already outmoded. In Germany, the Nazis were preparing for war. With tremendous resources being allocated to aircraft research and development, Hitler's designers were coming up with monoplane bombers, the performance of which threatened to exceed the then current RAF fighters. It was becoming more pressing that the RAF had faster aircraft. The fastest machines of the time were those developed for the Schneider Trophy air races. Britain held the Schneider Trophy with its Supermarine S-6B. This state-of-the-art monoplane was capable of speeds in excess of 340 miles an hour, a remarkable achievement aided by the new streamlining techniques. Rolls-Royce had developed an engine with cylinders in line as opposed to the rotary engine with large drag-causing frontal area. A development of this R-series engine, the BV-12 or Merlin, would go on to power Britain's next generation of fighters. At Hawker Engineering, Sidney Cam, seen here on the left, realizing the RAF's new requirement, set about the design of a fast monoplane fighter. This would be built around the new PV-12 engine, and for ease of production would utilize existing jigs and tools developed for Hawker Fury manufacture. The new aircraft was to be constructed from metal tubes supported by wooden formers and covered in fabric, producing a light but strong aircraft which would be rugged and easy to repair. The ministry would require an aircraft that could operate from a grass strip of a minimum length of 1,250 yards. Cam's aircraft would need a durable and forgiving undercarriage equipped with brakes. To reduce drag, this would have to be retractable. Cam's solution was to devise a wide-track inward-folding undercarriage where the wheels would be housed in the thickest part of the wing. This arrangement gave it stability on bumpy airfields. On November the 6th, 1935, K5083, the prototype Hurricane, made its first flight from Brooklands Airfield. Now fitted with the new Rolls-Royce Merlin C, producing 1,030 horsepower, the aircraft had a top speed of 315 miles per hour at 16,000 feet. After extensive flight trials at the Aeroplane and Armament Establishment at Marplesham Heath, the aircraft was approved for production. Hawkers received an order for 600. L-1547, the first aircraft off the production line, now officially known as the Hurricane, was delivered to the RAF in October 1937. The 16-month interval had been used productively to fine-tune the basic design. The aircraft now boasted 8 Browning machine guns, with 4 housed in each wing in 2 compact clusters. They were mounted just outside the arc of the propeller, giving it accurate and concentrated firepower. The guns selected for this purpose were the American-made and very reliable Colt Browning. Another advantage of this arrangement was that the guns could be adapted to take standard British Army rifle bullets. Each machine gun was supplied with 300 rounds, allowing 14 seconds of continuous fire. In its first year of service, the original 2-bladed propeller was found to be inefficient and was soon replaced with a de Havilland 3-bladed 2-pitch propeller, an improvement which greatly increased the Hurricane's rate of climb. With international tension increasing, the emphasis was swinging from bomber development to fighter production. At last, Britain had a fighter which was a potent deterrent. On September 1st, 1939, Nazi forces entered Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. Within 18 days, German blitzkrieg tactics had crushed Polish resistance. Next were Holland and Belgium. To try to counter this major offensive, the British Expeditionary Force, including 4 squadrons of Hurricanes, was sent to bolster the French defences. The French needed help, with no less than 7 German armies consisting of 1.5 million troops massing on their borders. By mid-May, the French and the British were fighting a rearguard action. Churchill, Britain's new Prime Minister and head of the new coalition government, was asked for more fighter reinforcements. In response, another 4 squadrons were dispatched. The Commander-in-Chief of Fighter Command, Sir Hugh Dowding, had strong reservations about this decision. He urged Churchill not to fritter away the RAF's fighter force, which would be needed for the defence of Britain. On May the 19th, this advice was heeded. Churchill made the unpopular decision that no more fighters would be sent, however pressing the requirement. A few months before, the Hurricane had tasted its first blood. An aircraft from No. 1 Squadron had shot down a Dornier 17 on October the 13th. This was to be the first enemy aircraft shot down by the RAF in World War II. As the weeks rolled by, Hurricane pilots claimed many more Dornier kills. It was clear that against German bombers, the Hurricane was a deadly opponent. The results of the Hurricane's first engagements with fighters, however, were less impressive. On December the 22nd, 3 Hurricanes patrolling the front line were set upon by German fighters diving from above and behind. The aircraft in question was the lethal Messerschmitt 109. The Bf-109 was more than a match for the Hurricane. Armed with 2 cannons in the wings and 2 7.9mm machine guns firing through the propeller with the aid of an interrupter gear, the 2 cannons not only had a greater range than the .303 machine guns in the Hurricane, but also had explosive shells which could penetrate armor plating. In addition, the Daimler-Benz engine was rated at 1175 horsepower, more powerful than the Merlin, giving it a higher top speed and a greater rate of climb. Together with this, the Daimler-Benz engine was fuel-injected, giving continuous power even in negative G maneuvers. Between May the 28th and June the 4th, 338,226 British, French and Belgian troops were evacuated from the beaches at Dunkirk. The Hurricane squadrons were rapidly withdrawn and forced to leave any valuable spares. So began the tense period of preparation before what was to become known as the Battle of Britain. Churchill said to the House of Commons,
"The Battle of France is over. The Battle of Britain is about to begin. Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duty. So bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour."
During the Battle of France, 477 RAF fighters were lost. Over 300 of these were Hurricanes. Although these losses were high, many vital lessons were learned, which would be invaluable in the months to come. Pilots harmonized their guns at 250 instead of the previously recommended range of 650 yards, making their hitting power more concentrated and greatly improving their effectiveness. The guns themselves had been prone to freezing at high altitudes. To rectify this, the gun lubricating oil was thinned down with paraffin. Further problems had been caused by moisture entering the gun barrels. These were now taped over with fabric, protecting them from the elements until the guns were first fired. The unofficial practice of fitting armor plate behind the pilot's seat had saved many lives. From this point on, Hurricanes had armor plating fitted as standard. Procedure had changed too. Tight wingtip formations were dropped in favor of looser groupings, improving overall visibility and allowing more space for evasive action. In the weeks before the now inevitable battle, Churchill continued to bolster the morale of the British people.
"We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on beaches, landing grounds, in fields, in streets, and on the hills. We shall never surrender."
Though Britain's situation seemed grave, it had 2 distinct advantages. As an island, there was a natural barrier between it and the massing invasion force. The second was man-made: radar. As early as 1934, it had been noticed that other passing aircraft would interfere with radio signals. A secret study group was set up to investigate the potential of this discovery. By the summer of 1940, Britain had a network of 58 radar stations with overlapping coverage. Cathode ray oscillographs were vigilantly monitored 24 hours a day. When echoes appeared on the trace, the operator measured the range, bearing and height on a calibrated dial. It was possible to estimate the number of aircraft from the characteristics of the trace. British aircraft carried a device which produced a stronger signal on the screen, letting the operator know that they were friendly. This information was then passed by telephone to the filter room at Fighter Command Headquarters, where it was plotted on a map to enable duplicates and errors to be filtered out. This information was relayed to operations rooms, where controllers could maneuver squadrons into position ready to intercept enemy attacks. At the time, the Germans didn't fully appreciate the importance of this defensive system. It allowed the RAF to organize pilots and their aircraft, which were in short supply, which could have been wasted in endless searches above the Channel and the southeast coast. It meant that valuable resources, such as fuel and engines, were deployed to best effect. Even at this late stage, continual improvements were being made to the Hurricane. Aircraft were fitted with the Rotor constant pitch propeller. The unit automatically altered its pitch under all conditions of air resistance and engine revs. The result was a better rate of climb and much reduced engine wear, a crucial factor when aircraft were stressed to the limits. From March 1940, all new production Hurricanes had metal wings. The reduced drag from this new development and further upgrading of the Merlin engine contributed to an improvement in the Hurricane's overall performance. The Hurricane's fighting partner was all metal. The Spitfire, manufactured by Supermarine, shared the same engine and armament. However, its flying characteristics were altogether different. A more streamlined design, it had a greater top speed and ceiling and was far more maneuverable. Experience gained in the Battle of France showed that the Spitfire was better suited to tackle the Messerschmitt 109. Theoretically, the Spitfire would attack the fighter screen, allowing the slower Hurricane to intercept the lumbering bombers unassailed. On the morning of July the 10th, the first large-scale attack was mounted on shipping. Off Dover, Stuka dive bombers attacked a convoy. Radar vectored British fighters to the scene, and only one small convoy ship was sunk. Over the next 9 days, the Germans probed the British defences. 30 British fighters were lost in minor skirmishes to the Germans' 44. On July the 20th, during another big raid on shipping, Dover harbour was also attacked. This led to the first big dogfight of the battle. 48 Me-109s and 40 Hurricanes and Spitfires were involved. Dowding had to tread a fine line. He had to conserve his fighter strength, knowing that the Germans' main thrust was still to come, but he also had to do what he could to protect shipping that Britain could ill afford to lose. At this time, Fighter Command only possessed 57 squadrons of modern fighters, 29 of which operated Hurricanes. 17 of these were part of the 11 Group, the sector that would bear the brunt of the fighting.
My name is Wing Commander Mackenzie. I flew with 501 Squadron in the Battle of Britain on Hurricanes. Once when I had almost run out of ammunition, having shot down one 109 into the sea and then attacked the second one, hit him but wasn't able to finish him off, and followed him down over the sea over Folkestone Harbour, and was able to form mate on him as he was only doing about 200 miles an hour. And finally, in order to make sure he went down, I slapped his port tail plane off with the tip of my starboard wing. About 3 feet came off the wing tip of my starboard wing and flew into the air, and we were down at about 200 feet and he went into the sea. Following that, I was attacked by 2 more Me-109s going back to England, or to try to make the airfield at Hawkinge, and I was shot up by them actually and had to land in a field just before Hawkinge airfield. I didn't ever reach the airfield and landed on almost on top of an anti-aircraft post.
Despite the extensive damage sustained in the incident and the following belly landing, Wing Commander Mackenzie's Hurricane V6799 was subsequently repaired and put back into service.
We were able to get our Hurricanes back after we'd been in combat and possibly been hit. They were much easier to repair and get back into the air again than the Spitfire. The Spitfire was developed after the Hurricane, and it has what is known as the monocoque construction, where the actual skin of the fuselage contributes to the strength, the overall strength of the aircraft. Hurricane, on the other hand, went back to the original small tubular construction of the Hind, the Fury, the Audax. The fabric skin, which took no strain, the strain was taken in the tubular construction.
On August the 12th, the Luftwaffe mounted its first major raids on radar stations and airfields. Although the airfield damage was considerable, Fighter Command's radar cover was only slightly impaired. 36 German aircraft were shot down for the loss of 13 Hurricanes and 6 Spitfires. The following day, August the 13th, was scheduled to be Eiglertag, or Eagle Day. The Germans believed that they had permanently knocked out 6 of Britain's radar stations. In fact, only the Isle of Wight installation would not be working that morning. The Luftflotten expected to reach their targets undetected. In addition, intelligence reports were telling them that the British fighter defences were so weakened they had no chance in defending the whole of the south of England. That day, 47 German aircraft failed to return to their bases for the loss of only 13 British fighters, and hardly any German bombs hit their targets. As it turned out, the massed synchronized raids of Eagle Day were disrupted by the weather. A second attempt was made on August the 15th. This time, the 3 Luftflotten, made up of 520 bombers and 1,270 fighters, attacked in unison. Radar stations detected incoming attacks from the south coast to Yorkshire. The huge formations were split up by ferocious counterattacks. Despite the heavy damage sustained by some southern aircraft factories and airfields, the total damage on the ground was out of all proportion to the number of German bombers involved. The day that was supposed to be the beginning of Britain's downfall turned out to be a rout. German losses were massive. To the Luftwaffe, it became known as Black Thursday. Fighter command's losses were also high. In fact, the total losses on both sides that day were never to be exceeded in the battle.
Our normal day would consist of taking off from our airfield at North Weald in the Epping Forest, flying down in the dark to an aerodrome which is close to the south coast. There we would refuel, and if we could get a little bit of sleep, because we'd taken off probably at 4 o'clock in the morning. While we were there, we'd get our breakfast brought down to us. Then the scramble alarm would be given fairly shortly afterwards. It became almost a routine, and dash out your aircraft, and you could go from being fast asleep to being up in the air in under 2 minutes. As you were climbing up and doing your cockpit checks, the controller would give you over the radio the height you had to climb to, the distance to the enemy aircraft that were coming in, their altitude, and probably their compass direction as well. And with the aids of radar, these interceptions were spot on every time. After you run out of ammunition, you would peel off and dive down to the nearest fighter airfield. We knew them all very well. Then the ground crews would rearm the aircraft, refuel them, and this they could do in about 15-20 minutes. And then you would be off again. Well, we'd done our routine thing of flying down to an airfield near Southend called Rochford. We took off from there in the afternoon to intercept a raid coming in, which we were told had about 90 aircraft in them, about 60 bombers with a fighter escort. So our job was to attack the bombers, and as I was attacking them, there were only 10 of us, as I was attacking them, I was bounced by the fighters, and my aircraft suddenly exploded on fire, and I had to get out, but rapidly. They reckon the temperature in the cockpit goes up from room temperature to about 3,000 degrees centigrade in under 10 seconds. So if you're not out in a 10-second period, you're never going to get out. But with magnificent RAF training, you instinctively go through all the drills to get yourself out of the aircraft rapidly. I was tumbling head over heels, but managed to get my very badly burned hand onto the ripcord and pull the release for the parachute. A couple of seconds later, the parachute had opened. Immediate reaction was to look up and see if the parachute was on fire, but fortunately it wasn't. And then I took stock of the situation. I was floating down from about 15,000 feet. As I looked down at the water far below, I noticed that my trousers had been blown off, my right shoe had been blown off, and I could smell that rather nauseating stench of my own burnt flesh, which wasn't very attractive. So the next thing that happened as I floated down, shock, I suppose, set in. I started to shiver with the cold and the shock, and then suddenly the water came up. I went into that, and then I was horrified to see that the parachute was coming down on top of me like a mushroom. I knew that if I didn't get away from that very quickly, I would be enshrouded by the chute and inevitably drowned. But when you're in that sort of situation, you struggle. So I got out from under the parachute. I could just see the English coast several miles away, so I set out in that direction. And then a little later, a vessel called the Trinity House put off a little dinghy with 2 men in it, and they came up and were rowing round me, just asking questions. Well, I'd had about half an hour of swimming, and I was a bit exhausted. And they said, "Are you English or are you German?" So at that point, I lost my temper, and I used every 4-letter word I could think of, at which point they realized I was an RAF officer.
Over the weeks that followed through to the early autumn, pilots on both sides displayed tremendous skill and courage. In spite of all their efforts, the Germans had not managed to secure air superiority. Without this, Operation Sea Lion was postponed, as it turned out, indefinitely. The RAF had, by the narrowest of margins, contained the greatest air force the world had yet seen. 461 RAF pilots had been killed out of a total force of just less than 1,000. 915 aircraft had been destroyed. Post-war Luftwaffe figures revealed the Germans had lost 1,733 aircraft. The Hurricane had proved itself in battle. Despite the proposed tactics of leaving the German fighters to the Spitfires, this hadn't always happened in the heat of battle. It was found, though, that the Hurricane, with its broad wing, could outturn both the Spitfire and the Messerschmitt 109 at combat altitudes. Its rugged airframe could sustain far more damage than any other fighter. These factors, together with it being a very stable gun platform, combined to make it the most successful fighter of the battle.
The Hurricane had a lot more elbow room. It had room for your legs. It could take a larger man than the Spit. For instance, in 501 Squadron, we had one pilot who was 6'6½". He could fly the Hurricane with comparative ease, but when we changed onto the Spit 2As, he was a most uncomfortable man indeed. The Spitfire was, to some people, was a little bit claustrophobic. It was rather a step up from the ME-109, which had a really tight cockpit in every way. In fact, we often wondered how the pilots in the ME-109 coped, because it was damn hard to operate in and to see out of also. Hurricane, you could see out of very well indeed. You had a good all-round vision.
It had been appreciated from an early date that the basic Hurricane had considerable development potential, leading first to the introduction of a Merlin 20 engine in a Hurricane 1 airframe. This was to be designated the Hurricane 2A. In early 1941, the Hurricane 2ASRS-2 was introduced. This had a slightly lengthened fuselage and represented an interim change on the production lines to make possible the installation of newly developed and interchangeable wings. The new wing allowed the installation of more armaments, greatly improving the Hurricane's hitting power. Initially, the 2B had 12.303 machine guns, with the provision for 2 250 or 2 500-pound bombs mounted underneath. The RAF knew full well that the cannon was a better destructive weapon than the .303 machine gun, but development of the cannon had been slow and beset with mechanical problems. It was not until 1935 that the Air Staff took notice of the Hispano-Suiza Company's development of a 20mm cannon. There was not, however, any great rush to equip the new monoplane with cannon, and it was not until the winter of 1938 that the Air Staff decided that the Hurricane and Spitfire should be so equipped. However, early trials in 1939 showed a number of defects which caused stoppages and other problems. It was not until the summer of 1941 that these problems were ironed out. Hurricane 2Cs were armed with 4 Hispano 20mm cannons. In total, 80 squadrons were eventually issued with 2Cs.
As an armament fitter, I was responsible for rearming all the aircraft on our flight. At the first aircraft we got were the 8 303 machine gun aircraft. So you had 4 303 Browning machine guns in each wing. The next, after several operations up and down the desert, we were returned to base to re-equip with newer aircraft, and we got the 12-gun Hurricane fighter. That had 6 machine guns in each wing. The bank of 4 here and 2 outboard on each wing. And then ultimately the Hurricane was developed, of course, because of its very deep chord wing. It could accept the 20mm cannon very easily without putting the blisters on the top or underneath, as you have to do with a Spitfire. So the Hurricane became a very good aircraft on that score. In the first campaign against the Italians, we moved forward very fast up through the desert. The Hurricane proved to be a very successful aircraft with this gypsy-like movement because of its robust undercarriage and robust construction, bearing in mind that we were moving every 3 or 4 days in some cases, so much so that we split the squadron in 2 and would leapfrog each other over, going right up through the desert into Libya, and then right through Libya. And then, of course, we were halted when the Germans beefed the Italians up a bit, and we had to retreat then. And we retreated at an even faster rate in some cases, going back into Egypt again. But all the time we were able to keep our aircraft, we'd stop and rearm on rough desert airstrips that were, all it did was clear them of the larger stones and boulders, and they were taking off in all sorts of conditions and places. After battle damage, they were much more easily repaired than the Spitfire, with the wooden frame fuselage and the dope fabric covering. They were able to be repaired after quite extensive damage on their own unit and turned round and back in the air again much more quickly than the Spitfire squadrons were, because the Spitfire with stress metal skin invariably had to go back to the factories or the maintenance units for repair.
When the Hurricane's planned life as a fighter had virtually come to an end in 1942, the introduction of yet another wing was to rejuvenate this remarkable aircraft. Known as the 2D, the aircraft was now armed with 2 40mm Rolls-Royce BF or Vickers Type S anti-tank guns, plus 2 harmonized .303 machine guns for sighting.
The ground crews are always busy when the aircraft are not flying. They can only relax when the kites are away, and that can be a pretty anxious time too. This morning, as usual, there is plenty of work to do on the Hurricanes. There's wonderful all-purpose machines. The Hurricane started life as a fighter, and with the Spitfires, damaged the enemy mightily in the Battle of Britain. There are many modified fighter versions. Then came the Harrier bombers, and now a new and formidable type, the Hurricane 2D, the tank buster. It is armored with 2 40mm cannons slung under the main planes. These, the largest bore weapons yet fitted on any flying aircraft, weigh only 320 pounds. They fire 2.5-pound shells, and the aircraft also carries 2 .303 machine guns, a devastating total of firepower. The Hurricane 2D is part of our answer to the German tank warfare technique, and a pretty sound answer too. We've got plenty more tricks like this in store, just waiting till they're wanted. Quite a lot of any man's time in war is spent waiting until he's wanted, waiting to go into action. This very moment some tank busters are wanted in a hurry. Engines burst into life. Trucks away, the can openers have a job to do, which won't wait. They taxi out. And roar across the sand into the sky. Most of the tank busters' pilots are old desert campaigners. for their aircraft were first in action in June 1942 after months of experimental work. In the first year of the Alamein offensive, they accounted for 19 enemy tanks, and during all the long triumphant pursuit, they have been doing brilliant work. Their job calls for skill and courage of a high order. Low over the desert they fly, low over the mechanized columns of our advancing army. Soon they have to climb to a great height to cross the dead ground between us and the enemy. Target below. Hurricanes peel off and swoop down to the attack. The German tank is blazing now, finished, knocked clean out of the wall by the tremendous power of fire from the tank busters' cannons. The job has been well done. And so the flight reforms and heads for home, for the little camp, which wherever it may be, is the center of the squadron's life.
The success of the wing variations led to the final production version of Hurricane 4. This new variant was fitted with the powerful Merlin 24 or 27 engine, delivering 1,620 horsepower. Seen here operating from a temporary strip in the Maidam, Calcutta. The new universal wing made the Mark IV a highly specialized ground attack aircraft and was used to a particularly devastating effect against the Japanese in Burma, where cannon-armed Hurricanes carried either 250 or 500-pound bombs. The Hurricane's ultimate firepower was achieved with the installation of a weapon system first proposed in 1941 and initially tested on the Hurricane in February 1942. When used operationally on the Hurricane 4, this was the first of all Allied aircraft to deploy rockets, leading to newspaper headlines that claimed that the little Hurricane packed a punch equivalent to the broadside from a destroyer. One of the main reasons for the Hurricane's longevity was the problem-riddled development of its successor, the Hawker Typhoon. The design for the Typhoon was initiated by Sidney Cam in 1937, and a prototype first flew in February 1940. But it wasn't until 1943 that the Typhoon began to realize its full potential and start to take over from the Hurricane in the ground attack role. The Hurricane's operational life extended well beyond the length of World War II. It was not until January 1947 that the RAF's last Hurricane Squadron, number 6, received replacement aircraft. With a total of 14,543 aircraft built, It was undoubtedly one of the great fighter aircraft of World War II.